Ezekiel Blackwood sat in the cramped law office on West 42nd Street, Manhattan, holding a pen that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a frequency that made his temples ache. Outside the grimy window, February rain streaked down glass that hadn't been cleaned in months, distorting the neon signs of the Korean barbecue joint across the street into bleeding smears of red and blue. Across from him, Cassandra Merrick slid the prenuptial agreement across the scratched wooden desk with a smile that looked like victory. She wore a crimson Armani dress that cost more than Ezekiel made in 2 weeks at the warehouse. Her nails, freshly manicured that morning at a salon in Soho, drummed against the mahogany with a rhythm that suggested impatience dressed as confidence. Ezekiel wore his only suit, a charcoal JCPenney special he'd bought in 2018 for his grandmother's funeral. The jacket pulled slightly at the shoulders because he'd gained muscle from lifting boxes 40 hours a week, sometimes more when overtime opened up. The lawyer, a middle-aged white man with thinning hair and a tie that had seen better decades, cleared his throat. He looked uncomfortable, kept adjusting his glasses like he wanted to be anywhere else. This wasn't the kind of law he practiced, not usually. Estate planning and small business contracts were his bread and butter. But Cassandra had insisted on someone cheap, someone who wouldn't ask questions, someone who would simply witness signatures and file paperwork without judgment. Cassandra leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking beneath her. "Sign it, Zeke." Her voice carried that particular tone he'd learned to recognize over the past year, the one that suggested she was doing him a tremendous favor by even being in the same room. It was the voice she used when explaining things to people she considered beneath her, which lately seemed to include him more often than not. "This protects what I've built. You understand, right?" Ezekiel's jaw tightened. He understood plenty. He understood that the woman sitting across from him, the woman he'd proposed to on one knee in the rain outside the Harlem Community Center, where they'd first met, now looked at him the way someone might look at a liability that needed to be managed. He understood that somewhere between her first promotion and her second, between her move from a studio in Washington Heights to a one-bedroom in the Upper West Side that he paid half the rent on despite making a quarter of her salary, she'd started measuring him against metrics he could never meet. A man making $42,000 a year needs to respect a woman making six figures. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Ezekiel felt the ripples, but didn't let them show on his face. He'd learned that too lately. How to go still inside while everything burned. What Cassandra didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know because Ezekiel's phone had been on silent during the signing appointment, and he hadn't checked his messages since yesterday afternoon, was that at exactly 11:47 the previous night, February 10th, 2026, a man named Nathaniel Grayson had left a voicemail that would change everything. The voicemail was still sitting there unheard, in a digital queue on a phone currently vibrating in Ezekiel's jacket pocket with a persistence that suggested importance. But Cassandra was staring at him, waiting, and the lawyer was checking his watch because he had another appointment in 20 minutes. And the pen was in Ezekiel's hand, and the moment demanded a response. Ezekiel looked down at the document. 23 pages of legal language that boiled down to a simple premise. If they divorced, he got nothing. Zero claim to the apartment he'd helped furnish, zero claim to the wedding venue deposit he'd scraped together by taking a second mortgage on his late grandmother's house in Queens, zero claim to spousal support, to shared assets, to any portion of the life they were supposedly building together. The prenup even included a clause stating that any business venture started during the marriage would be considered Cassandra's sole property if she contributed even a single dollar to its operation. It was airtight, brutal, and designed by someone who believed Ezekiel was exactly what he appeared to be. A warehouse worker with calloused hands, no college degree, and no prospects beyond the next paycheck. Cassandra's foot tapped against the linoleum floor. "I don't have all day, Zeke. I have a 4 o'clock with a client in Midtown." The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Blackwood, you have the right to have your own attorney review this before signing. I'd actually recommend—" Cassandra cut him off with a look sharp enough to draw blood. "He doesn't need his own attorney. This is standard. Then, Everyone does prenups now. It's 2026, not 1950. Ezekiel almost laughed. Standard. As if there was anything standard about a contract designed to ensure he walked away from a marriage with less than he'd entered it. As if it was normal for the woman who'd once cried in his arms about feeling alone in the world to now treat him like a potential thief who needed to be locked out of her vault before he could steal the silver. But he didn't laugh. He signed. The pen moved across paper in his careful, deliberate handwriting. Ezekiel Solomon Blackwood. Full legal name, the one his mother Lorraine had given him 30 years ago in a Bronx hospital where she'd labored for 14 hours without the father who'd promised to be there. Solomon had been his father's name too, though Ezekiel had spent most of his life trying not to think about that particular connection. Cassandra exhaled like she'd been holding her breath. The tension in her shoulders released. She leaned forward and kissed his cheek, a quick press of lips against skin that felt more like a stamp of approval than affection. Good boy. The words hit him somewhere deep in his chest, in a place that still remembered when she used to call him baby, when her voice went soft around the edges, when she said his name, when she looked at him like he was enough exactly as he was. The lawyer collected the papers, sliding them into a manila folder with practiced efficiency. He asked Ezekiel if he understood what he'd signed. Ezekiel nodded. The lawyer asked if he'd signed of his own free will, without coercion. Ezekiel nodded again, which was technically true, even if it felt like the biggest lie he'd ever told. Cassandra stood, smoothing her dress, checking her reflection in the window. She looked satisfied, like someone who'd just closed a successful negotiation, which Ezekiel supposed she had. They walked out of the office together, Cassandra's heels clicking against the tile hallway with sharp, staccato beats that echoed off the walls. In the elevator down, she checked her phone, scrolling through emails with the focused intensity she brought to everything work-related. Ezekiel watched the numbers descend on the digital display, feeling like he was falling, even though the elevator moved at a normal speed. On the street, the February cold hit them like a slap. Cassandra pulled her coat tighter, a dove-gray cashmere number that had cost $800. Ezekiel knew because he'd been with her when she bought it, had watched her hand over her credit card without hesitation, while he calculated that $800 was nearly 2 weeks of his take-home pay. She grabbed his arm, her grip firm through the fabric of his suit jacket. Don't look so sad. Her voice had shifted again, modulating into something that might have passed for warmth if you didn't know better. This was her public voice, the one she used when there were potential witnesses, when maintaining the appearance of a loving relationship mattered for reasons that had more to do with optics than emotion. You should be happy. You're marrying up. The words stung because they were meant to sound like a joke but carried the weight of truth underneath. Marrying up. As if marriage was a ladder and he was climbing rungs toward her level instead of meeting her as an equal. Ezekiel looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a stranger wearing the face of someone he used to know. Somewhere in the past year, Cassandra Merrick had replaced the woman he'd fallen for. Or maybe this had always been who she was, and he'd been too blind to see it, too desperate for connection, too grateful that someone like her had chosen someone like him. I didn't want to marry up, he said, his voice low and steady. I wanted to marry you. Cassandra scoffed, waving him off like he was being dramatic. Stop being so emotional. Men like you always get too emotional. She flagged down a taxi, the yellow cab pulling to the curb with a spray of slush from the gutter. She climbed in without looking back, calling through the open door that she'd see him at home later, maybe if her client meeting didn't run long. The cab pulled away, leaving Ezekiel standing on the sidewalk in the cold, watching her disappear into Manhattan traffic. He pulled out his phone. 3 missed calls, all from the same number, a 212 area code he didn't recognize. The voicemail notification glowed on his screen like a warning light. Ezekiel pressed play. The voice that emerged was cultured, professional, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd gone to law school at Harvard or Yale and now worked in an office where the coffee came from beans flown in from Colombia, and the art on the walls was original, not prints. Mr. Blackwood, this is Nathaniel Grayson calling from Grayson and Partners, LLP. I'm calling regarding an urgent matter concerning the estate of Solomon Blackwood. Your father passed away yesterday, February 10th, at 4:23 p.m. I'm the executor of his will, and I need to speak with you immediately about inheritance matters. Please call me back at this number as soon as possible. Again, this is Nathaniel Grayson, and the matter is time-sensitive. Thank you. Ezekiel's hand went numb. The phone almost slipped from his fingers. He caught it, barely, and stood there on West 42nd Street with people flowing around him like water around a stone, all of them rushing somewhere important while his entire world tilted sideways. Solomon Blackwood, his father, the man who'd left when Ezekiel was 9 years old, who'd walked out of their apartment in the Bronx one Tuesday morning and never came back. The man Lorraine refused to talk about except to say he'd had his reasons, though she'd never explained what those reasons were. The man Ezekiel had spent 2 decades trying not to think about, trying not to become, trying not to hate, even though hatred would have been easier than the complicated knot of emotions that lived where a father should have been, dead, and apparently wealthy enough to have an estate that required a lawyer from a firm with a name like Grayson and Partners LLP. Ezekiel's chest tightened, his vision tunneled. The sounds of the city, the honking horns and shouted conversations and rumble of the subway beneath his feet, all faded to a dull roar that felt very far away. He called the number back. Nathaniel Grayson answered on the second ring. Mr. Blackwood, thank you for returning my call. My father, Ezekiel said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow and distant. You said he died? I'm very sorry for your loss. The condolence sounded genuine, which somehow made it worse. Ezekiel didn't want this stranger's sympathy for the loss of a man who'd been absent for 21 years. He didn't want anything except answers to questions he hadn't known he needed to ask. I need you to come to our office, today if possible. There are matters we need to discuss in person. What kind of matters? A pause, then. Mr. Blackwood, I think it's best we have this conversation face to face. Can you come to Midtown? We're on 5th Avenue, 60th floor of the Steinberg building. Ezekiel looked at his watch. It was 2:30. He had a shift starting at the warehouse at 4, but suddenly that felt like the least important thing in the world. He told Grayson he'd be there in 40 minutes and hung up before the lawyer could say anything else. The subway ride to Midtown passed in a blur. Ezekiel sat with his phone in his hand, staring at nothing, while the train rattled through tunnels and passengers got on and off around him. He thought about his father, tried to summon a clear memory, but what came instead were fragments. A deep laugh, large hands, the smell of cologne, something woody and expensive, that seemed at odds with the cramped apartment they'd lived in. And then nothing. Just absence, a hole where a person should have been. The Steinberg building was the kind of place Ezekiel usually walked past without noticing. One of those gleaming towers of steel and glass that defined Manhattan's skyline but existed in a different economic universe than the one he inhabited. The lobby was all marble and modern art, with a security desk staffed by people in uniforms that probably cost more than his suit. He gave his name to the guard, who checked a list and directed him to the elevator bank on the east side. The elevator was mirrored on all sides, forcing Ezekiel to confront his own reflection from multiple angles. He looked tired, looked like a man who'd signed away his rights that morning and just found out his absent father had died. Looked like someone who didn't belong in a building where the elevator buttons were actual brass instead of plastic painted to look like brass. The 60th floor opened onto a reception area that took his breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Central Park, the bare trees stark against patches of snow that hadn't yet melted from the latest storm. The furniture was leather and chrome, the kind of modern minimalism that cost a fortune to achieve. A receptionist who looked like she'd walked off a magazine cover smiled at him with perfect teeth. Mr. Blackwood? He nodded, not trusting his voice. Mr. Grayson is expecting you, right this way. She led him down a hallway lined with original artwork, pieces he vaguely recognized from museum visits in high school. At the end of the hall, double doors opened into a conference room that was bigger than Ezekiel's entire apartment. Nathaniel Grayson stood when Ezekiel entered. He was 55, maybe 60, with silver hair and a suit that fit the way expensive suits did, like it had been made specifically for his body. His handshake was firm, his expression sympathetic in a professional way that suggested he delivered difficult news often enough to have perfected the appropriate demeanor. "Please sit." Ezekiel sat. The leather chair was so comfortable it felt like an embrace. Grayson slid a folder across the table, thick with documents. "I'm going to be direct with you, Mr. Blackwood, because I think that's what you'd prefer. Your father, Solomon Blackwood, passed away from a heart attack Tuesday afternoon. He was alone in his apartment in Tribeca. The building's doorman found him after he didn't answer calls from my office." Ezekiel opened his mouth, closed it, didn't know what to say. "Solomon was my client for 30 years. I handled all his legal affairs, which were extensive. He built a considerable fortune starting from very little." The folder sat between them like a challenge. Ezekiel didn't touch it. "How considerable?" Grayson's expression didn't change. "The estate is valued at approximately $4.2 billion. The number didn't make sense. Ezekiel heard the words, understood them individually, but strung together in that order, they became nonsense. 4.2 billion. Billion with a B. The kind of number you saw in articles about tech moguls or oil barons, not in sentences that included the phrase "your father." "That's not possible." "I assure you it's accurate. Solomon founded Blackwood Global Enterprises in 1985. Started with a single warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn. Built it into one of the largest private logistics and real estate conglomerates in North America. He was intensely private about his wealth. Most of his business dealings were conducted through layers of corporate entities and trusts. Very few people knew the full extent of what he'd built." Ezekiel's hands started shaking. He pressed them flat against the table to hide it. "Why are you telling me this?" Grayson opened the folder, pulled out a document, slid it across. It was a will, dated 3 months prior. "Because you're the sole beneficiary. Everything goes to you. The company, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolios, the art collection, the liquid assets, all of it." The room tilted. Ezekiel gripped the edge of the table, fighting a wave of vertigo that had nothing to do with the height of the building. "He left when I was 9. He walked out and never came back." "I know. He told me about that. Many times." Something in Grayson's tone made Ezekiel look up. The lawyer's expression had shifted, showing something that might have been actual emotion instead of professional sympathy. "Your father was complicated. He made choices that caused tremendous pain. But he never forgot you. Not once in 30 years. "Then why?" Ezekiel's voice broke. He swallowed hard, tried again. "Why didn't he come back?" Grayson pulled out another document, this one an envelope, cream-colored paper with Ezekiel's name, written in handwriting he didn't recognize but somehow knew was his father's. "He left you a letter. I think it might answer some of your questions. But before you read it, I need you to understand what you're inheriting isn't just money. There are responsibilities, legal obligations, business entities that employ thousands of people, a foundation that distributes tens of millions annually to charitable causes. This is going to change your life in ways you can't imagine yet." Ezekiel stared at the envelope, his name in black ink. Ezekiel Solomon Blackwood. 3 words that suddenly meant something completely different than they had an hour ago. "When?" His throat felt raw. "When did he write this?" "Last month, January 15th. He came to my office, updated his will, wrote the letter. Told me he had a feeling his time was short. Heart disease runs in his family." Ezekiel took the envelope with hands that still trembled. The paper felt heavy, quality stock, the kind of thing someone chose when they wanted words to carry weight beyond their meaning. "I'll give you privacy," Grayson said, standing. "Take as long as you need. I'll be in my office next door." Then Ezekiel was alone in a conference room on the 60th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, holding a letter from a dead father he barely remembered, trying to process the fact that his life had just fractured into before and after, and nothing would ever be the same again. He opened the envelope carefully, like it might shatter if handled too roughly. Inside were 12 pages of careful handwriting, the letters formed with precision that suggested a man who'd taken his time, who'd wanted to get every word exactly right. Son, the letter began, and Ezekiel had to stop reading because his eyes had gone blurry and his chest was too tight to breathe properly. He forced himself to continue. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I failed you in every way a father can fail a son. I left when you needed me. I stayed away when you wondered where I was. I built an empire while you grew up without me. These are facts I've lived with every day for 21 years. I left to protect you. I know that sounds like an excuse, and maybe it is, but it's also the truth. When you were 9, I was involved with people who would have used you and your mother to hurt me. Dangerous men who saw family as leverage. I thought putting distance between us would keep you safe. I was probably wrong. I was definitely a coward. I watched you from afar. Not often enough. Not as a father should. But I watched. October 2004, you were 15. Stood outside your high school in a Knicks jersey, too big for you, talking with friends. You laughed at something one of them said. You had my laugh, same rhythm, same sound. It broke my heart. I wanted to approach you. Spent 3 hours sitting in a car across the street, building up courage. Your mother saw me, came out, told me to leave. Told me I'd made my choice and needed to live with it. She was right, she usually was. Before I left, I gave her an envelope. $10,000. Asked her to use it for your future. She threw it back at me, so I left it on the hood of her car and drove away. Later, I heard she used it to pay off medical bills. That was like her. Always practical, even in anger. I found other ways to help. Anonymous donations to scholarships you applied for. Payments to hospitals when your mother got sick. I couldn't be there as a father, but I could remove obstacles. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. I built Blackwood Global with your face in my mind. Every deal, every acquisition, every calculated risk, I thought about the future you deserved. I thought about giving you freedom. Real freedom. The kind that comes from having enough resources that you never have to compromise who you are for anyone. Money isn't love. I know that. Money can't replace the father who should have been at your baseball games, your graduations, your difficult moments. But money is a tool. Used correctly, it's freedom. Freedom to walk away from anyone who doesn't value you. Freedom to build the life you choose instead of the life circumstances force on you. Freedom to help others the way I wish I could have helped you. You're 30 now, a man I don't really know but try to keep track of. I know you work hard. I know you're kind. I know you're engaged to a woman who doesn't deserve you, though I hope I'm wrong about that. I'm leaving you everything because you earned it by surviving without me. Because you became a good man despite my absence, not because of anything I did. Because I want you to have choices I never gave you. Use this inheritance however you see fit. Build something, destroy something, give it all away. It's yours without condition. But I hope you'll remember that the measure of a man isn't what he accumulates. It's what he does with what he's been given. It's how he treats people who can't benefit him. It's whether he has the courage to walk away from situations that diminish him. I loved you. I love you still. I'm sorry I never said it to your face. I'm sorry for everything I took from you by leaving. I'm sorry I was too broken to be what you needed. Your mother was the strongest person I ever knew. She raised you right. Thank her for me. Tell her I said she was right about everything, especially about me. Be better than I was. That's all any father can ask. With love and regret, Solomon Ezekiel set the letter down on the polished conference table and put his head in his hands. He didn't cry, but something inside him cracked, a fissure running through the foundation of who he'd thought he was, who his father had been, what his life meant. $4.2 billion. The number still didn't feel real, but the letter did. The handwriting, the voice coming through the words, the apology wrapped in explanations that didn't quite excuse but at least tried to explain. A knock on the door. Grayson's voice. Mr. Blackwood, are you all right? Was he all right? Ezekiel didn't know what all right even meant anymore. He stood, walked to the window, looked out at Central Park spread below like a postcard. Somewhere down there, Cassandra was probably finishing her client meeting, checking her phone, maybe thinking about him with the casual dismissiveness she'd perfected. Somewhere down there, his mother was working a shift at the hospital, even though she'd retired last year and took part-time work only because sitting still made her restless. Somewhere down there was the warehouse where he was supposed to clock in for a 4 to midnight shift, where his absence would be noted and possibly cost him the job. None of it mattered. Everything had changed 12 hours ago when his father died, and he'd been too busy signing a prenup to answer his phone. Ezekiel turned back to the conference room, to the letter and the will, and the lawyer waiting patiently in the next room. He folded the letter carefully, put it back in its envelope, slipped it into his jacket pocket over his heart. Then he opened the door and told Nathaniel Grayson he was ready to talk about what came next. The next 3 days passed in a haze of paperwork and revelations that kept reshaping the borders of Ezekiel's understanding. Grayson's conference room became a second home, the leather chair molding to his body as he signed documents, listened to explanations of trusts and holdings and corporate structures so complex they required flowcharts. Marcus Whitfield, the financial advisor from Goldman Sachs who managed the Blackwood portfolio, arrived on day 2 with a presentation that took 4 hours to deliver. The numbers stopped making sense after the first billion. After that, they were just abstractions, pixels on a screen that supposedly represented power, but felt more like a foreign language Ezekiel would never fully speak. He told no one, not Cassandra, who texted him twice asking why he'd missed his warehouse shift and whether he'd lost his job. Messages that dripped with the particular contempt she reserved for his failures. Not his mother, though keeping the secret from Lorraine felt like swallowing glass. Not the guys at the warehouse who covered his absence by telling the supervisor he had food poisoning, a kindness Ezekiel knew he didn't deserve since he had no intention of going back. The apartment in the Upper West Side felt smaller when he returned each night, the walls pressing in with knowledge of what existed outside them. Cassandra worked late most evenings, came home smelling of expensive restaurant dinners with clients, barely looked at him beyond cursory questions about his day that she didn't wait to hear answered. He'd started responding with vague truths, had meetings, downtown, business stuff. She nodded without interest, already moving past him toward the bedroom or bathroom, inhabiting space they technically shared but increasingly occupied separately. On the 4th day, Grayson introduced him to Rebecca Torres, a PR consultant whose job was to manage the public announcement of Solomon's death and Ezekiel's inheritance. She was 45, sharp-eyed, dressed in black from neck to ankle, like she was already in mourning for the privacy Ezekiel was about to lose. The memorial service is scheduled for March 3rd, she explained, pulling up a presentation on the conference room screen. 3 weeks from now. Your father's will stipulated it be held at the Blackwood estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. He purchased the property in 1992, 150 acres, Georgian mansion, capacity for 500 guests. Ezekiel absorbed this information like someone learning facts about a stranger's life. His father owned an estate. His father had enough friends, business associates, and people who wanted to be seen honoring him to fill 500 seats. His father had planned his own memorial service with the same meticulous attention he'd apparently brought to building a $4.2 billion empire. We've already sent invitations to key stakeholders, board members from Blackwood Global, major investors, political figures your father supported, philanthropic organizations that received his donations. Rebecca pulled up a guest list. Names scrolled past, some Ezekiel recognized from news headlines, others meaningless. Then one name stopped his breath in his throat. Merrick Strategy Group. Rebecca must have seen his expression change. They're contracted event coordinators. Your father used them for several corporate functions. Professional relationship going back 5 years. Is there a problem? Ezekiel stared at the name, mind racing through implications. Cassandra worked for Merrick Strategy Group, had worked there for 3 years, climbed from junior consultant to senior strategist, bragged about landing accounts with Fortune 500 companies and private wealth firms. She'd mentioned coordinating events at estates in Connecticut, though never with enough detail for him to connect dots he hadn't known existed to connect. No problem, he heard himself say. though the word tasted like copper. Who from the firm will be there? Rebecca checked her notes. Their senior Tom typically handles high-profile events. Let me see. She scrolled through emails. Cassandra Merrick is listed as lead coordinator. That's their top person for estate events. Very good at what she does, apparently. The universe, Ezekiel thought, had a vicious sense of irony. Or maybe his father did. Maybe Solomon had known about Cassandra, had researched the woman his son planned to marry, had arranged this final confrontation from beyond the grave as some kind of test or lesson or cosmic joke. That works, Ezekiel said, keeping his voice level. Keep them contracted. Grayson raised an eyebrow but didn't question the decision. Rebecca made a note, moved on to media strategy, talking about controlled leaks versus full press releases, about managing narrative, about the inevitable feeding frenzy when reporters discovered a black warehouse worker had inherited one of America's largest private fortunes. We recommend you don't make any public statements before the memorial. Let the announcement happen there. Controlled environment, invited guests only. Afterwards, you'll need security. She nodded toward a man Ezekiel hadn't noticed standing near the door, tall and broad-shouldered, ex-military bearing, impossible to miss. James Kowalski, former Secret Service. He'll be heading your protection detail. Kowalski stepped forward, shook Ezekiel's hand with a grip that suggested he could crush bones if circumstances required. Six-person team, Mr. Blackwood, rotating shifts, discreet presence until the public announcement, full visibility afterwards. We've already run background checks on immediate contacts. Your mother checks clean. Your fiancé, what about her? Kowalski's expression didn't change. Professional neutral, the face of someone who'd seen enough human ugliness to stop being surprised by it. Nothing criminal. Financial history shows steady income, good credit, some high-end spending habits. Social media presence consistent with her professional image. No red flags from a security standpoint. But something in the way he said it, the slight pause before red flags, suggested he had opinions he was keeping to himself. Ezekiel didn't push. Didn't want to know what a former Secret Service agent thought about Cassandra based on whatever deep dive investigation they'd conducted into her life, her finances, her digital footprint. That night, Ezekiel came home to find Cassandra in a mood that oscillated between manic energy and cutting frustration. She'd landed a major account, some tech billionaire's wife, who wanted a fundraiser gala that would make the society pages, budget apparently unlimited. Cassandra paced the apartment, describing florals and ice sculptures and a string quartet flown in from Vienna, talking so fast her words blurred together. This could make me partner. Gloria said if I execute this perfectly, if the client is happy, they'll consider me for the next opening. She finally looked at him, really looked, and her expression shifted to annoyance. Why are you just standing there? Say something, be happy for me. Ezekiel searched for the right response, the one that would have come naturally a year ago, when her successes felt like their successes, when he'd celebrated her wins because they were building something together. Now he just felt tired. Congratulations. That's great, Cass. The words came out flat. She heard it, her eyes narrowing. You could try to sound like you mean it. I know you're in a mood because you lost your warehouse job, but that's not my fault. I told you they don't appreciate you there. Maybe this is a sign you need to find something better. He hadn't told her he quit, hadn't told her anything. The assumption that he'd been fired, that his absence was failure rather than choice, would have been insulting if it wasn't so perfectly Cassandra. Of course, she'd assume the worst. Of course, she'd frame it as his inadequacy rather than circumstances beyond his control. I didn't lose the job. I left. Her pacing stopped. You quit without discussing it with me first? Zeke, we have rent. We have wedding expenses. We have... She gestured vaguely at the apartment, at the life they'd constructed. We have responsibilities. You can't just quit because you're having some kind of crisis. I'm not having a crisis. I had some things to take care of. What things? What could possibly be more important than keeping your job? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications she couldn't possibly understand. Ezekiel could tell her. Could end this right now. Watch her face transform from irritation to shock to whatever calculation came next when she processed that the man she'd forced to sign a prenup 3 days ago was now worth more than she'd earned in 1,000 lifetimes. But he didn't. Some instinct deeper than logic, older than rational thought, kept the words locked behind his teeth. He needed to see something first, needed to understand who Cassandra Merrick truly was when she believed he had nothing she wanted. Family stuff. My father died. The lie came easily because it was also true. Cassandra's expression flickered, sympathy warring with suspicion. She'd met Lorraine exactly twice, both times for obligatory holiday dinners that Cassandra had spent checking her phone and making observations about the Bronx apartment that had managed to sound like compliments while landing like insults. I didn't know you had a father. You never talk about him. I didn't have a relationship with him. He left when I was a kid, but he died and there were legal things to handle. Cassandra's face softened slightly, though whether from genuine compassion or relief that his absence had an explanation that didn't reflect poorly on her, Ezekiel couldn't tell. She crossed the room, put her hand on his arm, the touch light and impersonal. I'm sorry, that must be difficult, even if you weren't close. Then she pulled back, already moving toward her laptop, her attention shifting like water finding new channels. But you need to find another job soon. We can't live on just my salary. The wedding is in 4 months, and we're already over budget on the venue. The venue he'd mortgaged his grandmother's house to afford. The wedding that was supposed to be their celebration, but had become Cassandra's stage. Her moment to display success to colleagues and family who needed to see she'd made something of herself. He'd stopped recognizing his own wants in the planning months ago, reduced to nodding when she asked opinions that weren't really questions, signing checks he couldn't afford for decisions already made. About the wedding, Ezekiel started, then stopped, unsure what he meant to say. Cassandra looked up sharply. What about it? Nothing, just thinking we might need to scale back. Scale back, Zeke. I've already sent invitations. The venue is booked. The photographer is booked. You can't just decide now that we need to scale back because you impulsively quit your job. Her voice had taken on that edge he'd learned to recognize, the one that preceded arguments he'd never win because she'd already decided the outcome before he'd finished speaking. Ezekiel felt exhaustion settle into his bones, heavy as sediment. You're right. Never mind. Cassandra studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she returned to her laptop, dismissing him as thoroughly as if he'd left the room. Ezekiel retreated to the bedroom, closed the door, pulled out his phone. The text to Grayson was brief. Proceed with memorial as planned. Don't change the coordinator. I need to be there. The response came within minutes. Understood. You'll see full briefing next week. Are you sure about this approach? Ezekiel stared at the question. Was he sure? Was he sure about keeping secrets from the woman he'd planned to marry? Was he sure about letting her coordinate the event where his inheritance would become public knowledge? Was he sure about weaponizing truth in a way that felt uncomfortably close to revenge, even if he told himself it was just clarity, just seeing reality without filters? Yes, he typed back, I'm sure. The week that followed established a rhythm that felt like living in two worlds simultaneously. Days belonged to Blackwood Global, to meetings with executives who'd worked for his father and now reported to him, to learning the architecture of an empire built from warehouses and real estate and shrewd investments that had compounded for 40 years. Nights belonged to the apartment, to Cassandra's escalating wedding mania, to the charade of being Ezekiel the warehouse worker who'd made a mistake quitting his job. He started wearing the persona-like clothes, something he could put on and take off depending on which version of himself circumstances required. With Grayson and the Blackwood Global team, he was the heir learning to navigate inheritance. With Cassandra, he was the fiancé she'd stopped seeing months ago, background noise in her ambitions. The pretending should have been harder. That it wasn't troubled him in ways he didn't examine too closely. Lorraine called on Thursday evening, her voice warmed through the phone speaker, asking if he was coming to dinner Sunday like he usually did. Ezekiel hesitated, torn between the secret growing heavier each day and the knowledge that his mother would see through him the moment they were in the same room. She'd raised him alone, worked doubles at the hospital to keep their heads above water, never complained about the father who'd vanished or the life she'd been left to build without him. She deserved to know. "I'll be there. I need to talk to you about something." A pause. "Everything okay, baby?" "Yeah, Mama. Everything's fine. Just need to talk." He heard her processing this, deciding whether to push now or wait. She chose waiting. "Okay, I'll make pot roast." Sunday arrived cold and clear, February giving way to early March with grudging concessions toward warmth. Ezekiel took the subway to the Bronx, the familiar route he'd traveled since childhood, watching neighborhoods shift from Manhattan's glossy prosperity to the grittier reality of working-class survival. His mother's building looked exactly as it always had, 5 stories of brick weathered by decades of winters, fire escape zigzagging up the facade like a scar. Lorraine opened the door before he knocked, must have been watching from the window, a habit left over from when he was young, and she'd waited anxiously for him to come home safe from whatever danger she'd imagined lurked in streets that were honestly no worse than any other part of the city. She pulled him into a hug that smelled like lavender and cooking, her arms still strong despite 58 years of hard living. "You look tired." "I'm okay." She held him at arm's length, studying his face with the focused attention of someone trained to spot distress in patients who wouldn't admit to pain. "No, you're not. Come inside. Tell me what's wrong." The apartment was small but immaculate, same furniture she'd had for 20 years because it still worked, and replacing things that worked felt wasteful. Photos covered one wall, a chronology of Ezekiel growing up in frames, school pictures with missing teeth and too big clothes, high school graduation, a few from college before money ran out and he dropped out to work full-time. His father wasn't in any of them. Lorraine had removed every trace of Solomon Blackwood from visible surfaces, though Ezekiel knew she kept one photo in her bedroom drawer, the only picture from their wedding before everything fell apart. She served pot roast on the dining table she'd bought used when Ezekiel was 5. Same table where he'd done homework while she worked night shifts, where they'd eaten breakfast before school, where he'd told her about Cassandra, voice full of hope that felt naive in retrospect. "So talk to me." Ezekiel set down his fork, appetite vanishing under the weight of what he needed to say. "Solomon died, February 10th. Lorraine went very still. Her hand tightened around her water glass. "How do you know?" "His lawyer called me, left a message the day he died." She absorbed this, face betraying nothing, years of nursing training giving her a practiced neutrality that hid whatever she actually felt. "I see. And?" "And he left me everything. $4.2 billion. The number landed like a stone dropped in still water. Lorraine's expression didn't change for several seconds, processing, reaching some critical threshold before emotion could break through. When it did, her face crumpled, tears spilling over before she could stop them. "That man," she whispered, voice catching. "That goddamn man." Ezekiel moved around the table, knelt beside her chair, let her grip his shoulders while she cried tears he suspected were decades overdue. Not grief for Solomon's death exactly. Something more complicated. Anger and relief and vindication and loss all tangled together. "I'm sorry, Mama. I didn't want to tell you over the phone." She wiped her eyes, took a shuddering breath, found her composure through visible effort. "Don't apologize. You did nothing wrong. Neither did he, really. Not about this. How is leaving billions to a son he abandoned not wrong?" Lorraine laughed, the sound bitter and broken. "Because he was trying to make it right the only way he knew how. Money was the only language Solomon spoke fluently. He thought it could solve everything, buy anything, fix what he'd broken by throwing enough cash at the cracks." She stood, crossed to the kitchen, poured herself water she didn't drink, just needed her hands occupied. When she spoke again, her voice had steadied. "He came back once. Did his lawyer tell you that?" "He mentioned it in a letter, October 2004. He stood across from your school like a stalker. I saw him from the bodega where I was buying groceries. Went over, told him to leave, told him he'd made his choice and didn't get to wander back when guilt got heavy." Her hands gripped the counter. He tried to give me money, always with the money. $10,000 cash in an envelope like that fixed anything. I threw it at him. Told him we didn't need his blood money. But you used it. She turned, met his eyes. I found it on my car 2 hours later. And yeah, I used it. Had medical bills from when you broke your arm skateboarding. Insurance didn't cover everything. Used his guilty conscience to pay for pins and therapy. Felt good, actually, using his money to fix problems he should have been there to help with. Ezekiel stood, went to her, this woman who'd raised him alone and never let him see how hard it was. How many nights she'd probably cried after he fell asleep. How many times she'd looked at the photos in her drawer and wondered what life might have been if Solomon had stayed. He paid your cancer treatment too. 2015. Through some anonymous charity. Lorraine closed her eyes. I wondered. The bills just disappeared. I thought maybe insurance had made a mistake. Didn't want to ask questions that might make them realize and charge me retroactive. It was him, watching from distance, trying to help without being present. Coward's way out. Maybe, but he left me everything, Mama. Everything he built. I don't know what to do with it. She gripped his face in her hands, looked at him with intensity that reminded him of childhood, of the countless times she'd made him listen to hard truths. You use it to be free, free from anyone who doesn't value you, free to build a life on your terms, free to help people who need it. That's what you do. I haven't told Cassandra. Lorraine's expression shifted, going carefully neutral in a way that suggested opinions she was choosing not to voice. Why not? Because I need to see something first. Need to know who she is when she thinks I'm still broke. His mother studied him, seeing more than he wanted to show. What has she done, baby? So Ezekiel told her about the prenup forced 2 days before he learned about the inheritance, about the public humiliations that had become so common, he'd stopped flinching, about overhearing Cassandra's phone conversation planning to leave him 6 months after the wedding, about the weight of trying to be enough for someone who'd decided he never would be. Lorraine listened without interrupting, her face hardening with each new detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. That girl doesn't love you. I'm sorry to say it plain, but you need to hear it. I know. Then why haven't you left? Ezekiel struggled to find words for the complicated knot of emotions that kept him tethered to a relationship that hurt more than it healed. Because I keep hoping she'll remember who we were, when it was good, when we were partners. People don't change back into who they were, Zeke. They change into who they're becoming. And Cassandra is becoming someone who measures your worth by your bank account. Someone who will marry you for optics and leave when you stop serving her ambitions. She poured coffee neither of them would drink, the ritual of hospitality giving her hands purpose. The memorial service. When is it? March 3rd, 3 weeks. And Cassandra will be there? Her firm is coordinating the event. She's lead organizer. Lorraine's eyebrows rose. Does she know you'll be there? No. So she'll be working this memorial, organizing for wealthy people she wants to impress, and then they'll announce that the heir is her fiancé, the warehouse worker she forced to sign away rights to her fortune. That's about it. His mother shook her head slowly, something like admiration mixing with concern. That's cruel, baby. I raised you better than revenge. It's not revenge, it's clarity. She gets to see who she was trying to cut out of her life before she knew what she was cutting away. And I get to see what she does when the truth comes out. And then what? Ezekiel didn't have an answer. Hadn't thought beyond the moment of revelation, the expression on Cassandra's face when she realized what the prenup had actually done, what she'd actually lost by measuring him wrong. Lorraine touched his cheek gently. Just remember that wealth doesn't make you immune to pain. Money might solve some problems, but it creates others. And the hole your father left in you won't fill with billions, baby. That's work you have to do yourself. They ate pot roasts that had gone cold while they talked, cleaned dishes side by side like they'd done 1,000 times. Ezekiel told her about Blackwood Global, about the estate in Connecticut, about the life waiting for him that still didn't feel real. She listened, asked questions, treated it all with the same practical approach she brought to everything. When are you going to move me to some fancy apartment? Her tone was teasing, but Ezekiel heard the uncertainty underneath. Soon as you'll let me. Penthouse on the Upper East Side. 3 bedrooms, park views, doorman who'll treat you like royalty. I don't need all that. I know, but you deserve it. 30 years working doubles, raising a kid alone, never complaining. You deserve to rest, Mama. Her eyes filled again, but she blinked the tears back. Your father tried to buy his way back into my good graces. You trying to do the same? I'm trying to give you what you earn. There's a difference. She pulled him into another hug, tight and fierce, the kind that said more than words about love and pride and hopes she'd carried for him since the day he was born. Just promise me something. Anything. Don't let money make you hard. Don't let wealth teach you to measure people the way Cassandra measures you. Stay who you are, baby. Stay the boy who volunteers at community centers and helps old ladies with the groceries and remembers everyone's name. That's worth more than any fortune. Ezekiel promised, though he wondered if keeping that promise was possible when everything around him was changing at a speed that made his head spin. Money, he was learning, didn't just alter circumstances. It altered perception, both his own and everyone else's. It would alter Cassandra's perception in exactly 17 days when the truth came out in the most public way possible. He left his mother's apartment as the sun was setting, painting the Bronx in shades of amber and shadow. The subway ride back to Manhattan felt like crossing borders between countries, leaving one life behind and returning to another that still fit poorly despite 3 weeks of wearing it. The apartment was dark when he arrived. Cassandra had left a note on the kitchen counter. Client dinner, don't wait up. The handwriting was hurried, careless, the kind of note you'd leave for a roommate rather than someone you claimed to love. Ezekiel crumpled the note, threw it away, stood in the kitchen of an apartment he helped pay for but had never felt like home. His phone buzzed. Text from Grayson. Memorial details finalized. Full briefing tomorrow, 10 a.m. Security team activated. Another text. This one from Marcus Whitfield. First quarter earnings reports ready for review. Blackwood Global up 12% from projections. Your father would be pleased. A third from Rebecca Torres. Media strategy approved by board. Expect major coverage post-announcement. Prepared statements attached. Review and confirm. Messages from a life that was becoming more real while the life he'd known for 30 years became the pretense. Ezekiel set the phone down, poured himself whiskey from a bottle Cassandra kept for her clients she brought home. Expensive single malt he'd never developed a taste for but drank anyway because tonight felt like a night that required something stronger than water. The whiskey burned going down, warmth spreading through his chest without touching the cold place deeper inside where questions lived that had no good answers. Questions about whether revealing truth publicly made him righteous or vindictive, whether Solomon's billions absolved his absence or just made it more tragic, whether Cassandra had ever loved him or if he'd been a placeholder from the start, someone safe to practice partnership on before she found a real catch. The memorial was 17 days away, 17 days of living in suspension between who he'd been and who he was becoming. 17 days until Cassandra discovered that the man she'd dismissed as beneath her was about to inherit one of America's largest private fortunes. 17 days until everything changed again, this time publicly, irrevocably, in front of 500 witnesses who would bear testimony to the moment a prenup designed to protect wealth ended up protecting the person it was meant to exclude. Ezekiel finished the whiskey, poured another, stood at the window looking out at Manhattan's glittering skyline. Somewhere out there, people were living normal lives, facing normal problems, making normal decisions that didn't involve billions or betrayals or fathers who built empires and left sons behind. He envied them their simplicity, their problems that money could solve, their relationships uncomplicated by wealth they hadn't earned. But envy wouldn't change facts. The memorial was coming. The truth was coming. Cassandra would be there when it arrived, clipboard in hand, coordinating an event she didn't know was about to reshape her entire understanding of reality. And Ezekiel would watch it happen, see her face transform, know finally whether the woman he'd almost married had any capacity for love that existed outside calculations of advantage. 17 days. The countdown felt like a fuse burning toward detonation. The 17 days compressed and stretched simultaneously, time behaving strangely when every moment carried weight it hadn't before. Ezekiel moved through his new reality, learning the mechanics of wealth, sitting in boardrooms where decisions involving millions were discussed with the casual tone people usually reserve for discussing lunch options. Marcus Whitfield walked him through investment portfolios, real estate holdings scattered across 3 continents, venture capital stakes in companies Ezekiel had heard of but never imagined having connection to. Solomon had been methodical, diversified, careful in ways that suggested someone who understood that empires could crumble if built on unstable foundations. The Blackwood Global executives treated Ezekiel with careful deference that felt rehearsed, like they'd prepared for this transition even though Solomon's death had been sudden. They presented quarterly reports, asked for guidance on expansion projects in Singapore and Dubai, deferred to his judgment on matters he had no business judging. He learned to say things like, "Let me review the numbers and get back to you," instead of admitting he had no idea what half the terminology meant. Grayson assigned him homework, binders full of documents explaining corporate structures and fiduciary responsibilities and tax implications that made Ezekiel's head ache. He read them late at night in the apartment, while Cassandra slept or worked in the other room, absorbing information that felt like studying for a test he'd never agreed to take. The security detail became constant but invisible. James Kowalski's team followed at distances, calibrated to blend into urban background, watching from cars parked on side streets, sitting in coffee shops, nursing drinks they didn't want, creating a protective bubble Ezekiel barely noticed until he looked for it. Twice he spotted them, recognized the particular way they held themselves, the scan and assess pattern their eyes followed. It should have felt invasive. Instead, it felt oddly comforting, knowing someone was watching, that he wasn't entirely alone in this transformation. Cassandra noticed nothing. Her world had contracted to wedding planning and the new account she'd landed, the tech billionaire's wife who wanted an event that would trend on social media and make the Times Society pages. She spent hours on the phone negotiating with florists and caterers, her voice taking on a particular quality when she spoke with vendors, sweet but firm, the tone of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and wouldn't accept substitutes. She'd stopped asking about his job search after the first few days, stopped pretending interest in how he spent his time. He told her he was doing consulting work, helping a family friend with business matters. The lie sat easily on his tongue, easier than it should have. She nodded without curiosity, already moving to her next concern, which was whether the venue she'd booked for their wedding had proper acoustics for the string quartet she wanted, or if they'd need to rent additional equipment. The wedding. That approaching deadline felt surreal now. A commitment made by a different version of himself to a different version of Cassandra. Both of them ghosts haunting a relationship that had died somewhere along the way without either of them officially pronouncing it dead. 10 days before the memorial, Cassandra came home energized by news that made her practically vibrate with excitement. She'd been assigned to coordinate the Blackwood Estate Memorial Service, a huge opportunity that could cement her reputation as the go-to person for high-profile events. Do you know how big this is? Solomon Blackwood was worth billions. The guest list reads like Forbes and Fortune had a baby. If I execute this perfectly, partnership is basically guaranteed. She paced the apartment, describing logistics, security protocols, the challenge of making a memorial service feel appropriately somber while still showcasing elegance. Ezekiel listened from the couch, watching her animation, the way her hands moved when she talked about things that excited her. This was Cassandra at her best, competent and driven and alive with purpose. He'd fallen in love with this energy once, back when it had felt like they were building towards something together instead of running parallel tracks that happened to occupy the same space. The estate is incredible. Georgian mansion, 150 acres in Greenwich. I did a site visit yesterday. The family wants everything perfect. Very particular about honoring Solomon's legacy. What family? The question came out before Ezekiel could stop it. Cassandra paused her pacing. I don't know specifics. The lawyers are handling everything. Apparently there's a son, but he's been kept out of the public eye. Anonymous heir, very mysterious. She resumed moving, momentum carrying her past any real interest in the answer. Anyway, this is my chance to prove I can handle ultra-high net worth clients, the kind of people who expect perfection and have the resources to make your life hell if you mess up. Ezekiel felt something twist in his chest, watching her plan an event she didn't know would detonate her entire understanding of their relationship. Part of him wanted to tell her right then, end the charade, let her process in private rather than public. But another part, the part that had signed the prenup while his phone held news that would have changed everything, that had endured months of casual cruelty and public dismissal, that part wanted her to experience the full weight of revelation in the moment it arrived. Sounds like a big opportunity, he offered, voice neutral. She glanced at him, something flickering across her face too quick to read. You could try to sound more supportive. I know you're going through whatever existential crisis made you quit your job, but this is important to me. Partnership level important. The accusation stung because it was partially fair. He hadn't been present lately, not really, too consumed with learning to be a billionaire while pretending to be broke. But the larger truth, the one Cassandra couldn't see because she'd stopped looking at him months ago, was that he'd been absent long before Solomon died. Checked out emotionally somewhere between the first time she'd introduced him as just a friend and the moment she'd slid a prenup across the desk with a smile that said she was protecting herself from his poverty. I'm happy for you, Cass, really. I hope it goes exactly how you want. She studied him for a moment, suspicion creeping into her expression, like she sensed something underneath the words but couldn't identify what. Then she shook it off, returned to her laptop, already composing emails to vendors about timeline adjustments in contingency plans. Ezekiel retreated to the bedroom, closed the door, pulled out his phone. Text to Grayson. She's coordinating the memorial, just told me about it. Doesn't know I'm the heir. The response came within seconds. Confirmed, she submitted final event proposal this morning. Security, catering, program all approved. You still want to proceed with public announcement? Ezekiel stared at the question. Last chance to change course, to tell Cassandra privately, to handle this with dignity instead of drama. But dignity was what he'd been offering for months while she carved away at his self-worth with 1,000 small cuts. Dignity hadn't earned him respect. Maybe truth delivered publicly, irrevocably, in front of the people whose opinions she valued most, would teach her something about measuring worth. Yes, he typed. Proceed as planned. A week before the memorial, Cassandra's stress levels reached critical mass. She snapped at him for leaving dishes in the sink, for existing in the apartment while she was trying to work, for breathing too loudly while she was on conference calls. Ezekiel absorbed her irritation like a sponge, saying nothing, recognizing that her anxiety had nothing to do with him and everything to do with pressure she'd invited into her life by chasing success that kept receding just beyond her grasp. She worked 18-hour days the final week, barely slept, lived on coffee and takeout she ordered to the apartment, and ate while typing. Ezekiel watched her run herself ragged, pursuing approval from people who wouldn't remember her name 6 months after the event ended. He wondered if this was what Solomon had been like, consumed by building, unable to separate self-worth from achievement. Maybe the capacity for obsession ran in families, passed down through blood, like eye color, or predisposition to heart disease. On March 2nd, the day before the memorial, Cassandra left the apartment at dawn with 3 suitcases full of backup supplies and contingency equipment. She'd be at the estate all day, supervising setup, staying overnight in one of the guest rooms to ensure everything ran smoothly the next morning. She kissed Ezekiel's cheek in the distracted way she'd perfected, already mentally at the venue before her body followed. Wish me luck. You don't need luck. You'll be great. She smiled, the first genuine warmth he'd seen from her in weeks. Thanks, babe. I'll see you tomorrow night. Tell you all about it. Tomorrow night, after everything changed, after her world inverted, and she understood what the prenup had actually accomplished, after she learned that luck had nothing to do with success or failure, that measuring people by bank accounts was a knife that cut both directions. Ezekiel stood in the empty apartment after she left, listening to silence that felt heavier than it should. His phone buzzed. Grayson, final briefing at 2 p.m. and estate walkthrough, security protocols, program review. Car service will pick you up at 1:30. Another text. Lorraine, you ready for tomorrow, baby? He typed back, as ready as I'll get. You coming? Her response, wouldn't miss it. Going to watch my son become a billionaire. Also going to watch that girl realize what she lost. Both should be interesting. Rebecca Torres sent him the final program, timeline broken into 15-minute increments. The announcement would come at 7 p.m. after dinner during what the schedule called legacy recognition and succession statement. Antiseptic language for the moment Ezekiel would stand in front of 500 people and accept an inheritance that would transform him from anonymous to infamous, from background to spotlight, from the man Cassandra thought she knew to someone she'd never bothered to discover. The car service arrived precisely at 1:30, a black sedan with tinted windows driven by someone from Kowalski's team. They took the FDR Drive north, crossed into Connecticut, wound through suburbs that grew progressively wealthier until they reached Greenwich, where wealth stopped announcing itself and simply existed as assumed baseline reality. The Blackwood estate sat behind iron gates at the end of a private road lined with old-growth trees. The gates opened automatically as they approached, security already briefed on his arrival. The driveway curved through landscape grounds, past frozen fountains and sculpture gardens, toward a mansion that looked like it had been transported from English countryside and deposited in New England with all its history intact. Cassandra's team was everywhere, setting up chairs in the main ballroom, testing sound equipment, arranging floral displays that must have cost more than most people's monthly rent. She stood near the entrance in black pants and a crisp white shirt, clipboard in hand, directing workers with the focused intensity of a general deploying troops. She didn't see Ezekiel arrive, too absorbed in ensuring centerpieces were positioned at exact intervals. Grayson met him at a side entrance, led him through hallways lined with art that Solomon had collected over decades. Paintings Ezekiel vaguely recognized from textbooks, sculptures that belonged in museums, tapestries that looked medieval, and probably were. His father's taste had run toward classical, toward beauty that lasted centuries instead of trends that faded with seasons. The briefing happened in what had been Solomon's study, a room dominated by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a desk that looked like it weighed more than a car. Grayson walked him through the evening's schedule, showed him where he'd sit during dinner, explained the choreography of the announcement. Rebecca Torres reviewed media protocols, showed him prepared statements for the inevitable interviews that would follow. Kowalski outlined security measures, exit routes, contingency plans if things went sideways. Any questions? Grayson's tone suggested he hoped the answer was no. Ezekiel had 1,000 questions, none of them about logistics. Questions about whether his father had sat at this desk planning the memorial that would introduce his son to the world. Questions about how someone built a fortune this large while abandoning the people who should have mattered most. Questions about whether wealth insulated you from regret or just gave you more expensive ways to avoid confronting it. No questions, he said instead. They left him alone in the study. Ezekiel sat in his father's chair, ran his hands over wood worn smooth by decades of use, tried to conjure some sense of connection to the man who'd occupied this space. Nothing came. Solomon remained abstract, a collection of facts without emotional resonance, a stranger who happened to share Ezekiel's DNA and last name. The desk drawers were empty except for one, the bottom right, which held a leather journal. Ezekiel opened it, found pages filled with Solomon's handwriting, entries dated sporadically over the past 5 years. Not a diary exactly, more a record of thoughts too private to share but too persistent to ignore. He flipped to a random entry dated 2 years prior. Saw a photo of Ezekiel today. Business Journal did a piece on warehouse automation, used his facility as example. He was in the background of one shot, barely visible, but I recognized him immediately. 30 years old now. He has my father's jaw, his mother's eyes. He looks tired. I did that. Put that exhaustion in him by not being there, by choosing distance over difficulty, by being a coward who couldn't face the consequences of my choices. Ezekiel's throat tightened. He flipped to another entry, this one from 6 months ago. Lawyers finalized the will today. Everything to Ezekiel. Grayson asked if I was certain, reminded me there are nephews, cousins, charitable foundations that might expect inclusion. I told him I'm leaving it all to the person I failed most completely. Maybe he'll do something worthwhile with it. Maybe he'll burn it all down. Either way, it's his choice. I took enough choices from him already. More entries, scattered across months. Solomon tracking his son from distance, collecting scraps of information, building a picture of Ezekiel's life from fragments and shadows. Ezekiel found an entry from just 2 months before Solomon died. Hired an investigator to do background on Ezekiel's fiancée. Report came back today. Cassandra Merrick, ambitious, intelligent, cold. Investigator's assessment. She views the relationship as transaction, not partnership. Client's son is convenience, not priority. I want to call him, warn him, but what right do I have? I abandoned him. I don't get to show up now offering unsolicited opinions about his relationships. Still, I worry. He deserves someone who sees his worth, someone who values character over credentials. I hope he finds that, even if I'm not around to see it. The journal fell closed in Ezekiel's hands. His father had known about Cassandra, had investigated her, had wanted to warn him, but stayed silent out of guilt over having no right to paternal concern. The irony was bitter. Solomon could have prevented this whole situation with a single phone call, but pride or shame or cowardice had kept him quiet. And now Ezekiel was about to publicly demonstrate exactly why his father's concerns had been justified. Voices in the hallway pulled him back to present. He returned the journal to its drawer, stood, straightened his suit. The rental tuxedo fit better than his regular clothes, tailored to specifications Rebecca Torres had somehow obtained without his direct involvement. He looked different in it, like someone who belonged in rooms this grand, though the face in the mirror still seemed shocked by the transformation. Evening arrived with the specific quality of light that comes just before sunset. Everything edged in gold that would fade to blue, then black. Cars began arriving at the gates, headlights streaming up the driveway, valets directing vehicles with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this countless times. Guests emerged in formal wear, diamonds catching light, conversations pitched at volumes suggesting people accustomed to being overheard and unconcerned about eavesdroppers. Ezekiel watched from a second-floor window, recognizing faces from news coverage and Forbes profiles. Tech CEOs, hedge fund managers, politicians whose campaigns Solomon had funded, artists and philanthropists, and people whose presence at an event like this conferred legitimacy by association. 500 of them, filing into the ballroom where Cassandra had arranged everything to perfection. She moved through the crowd with grace that came from hours of practice, faking confidence until it became real. She checked details invisible to guests, ensured drinks circulated at appropriate intervals, managed the invisible machinery that made events feel effortless. Watching her work, Ezekiel felt a strange pride mixed with sadness. She was good at this, truly skilled, deserved the partnership she was chasing. Under different circumstances, he might have been happy for her tonight, celebrating her success instead of preparing to destroy her understanding of who they were to each other. But circumstances were what they were. Choices made couldn't be unmade. Cassandra had signed a prenup designed to protect her wealth from his poverty, and in doing so had locked herself into a contract that would now shield him from her calculation. Grayson appeared at his elbow. "It's time. Your mother just arrived. I've seated her at your table." Ezekiel descended the main staircase feeling like he was walking towards something irrevocable. The ballroom's entrance framed him for a moment, 500 conversations creating a wall of sound that parted slightly as people registered his presence without recognizing his significance. Not yet. That was coming. Lorraine sat at a table near the front, wearing a dress Ezekiel had never seen, probably bought specifically for tonight. She looked beautiful and slightly uncomfortable. A woman who'd spent her life in scrubs and practical clothing, now dressed for an event that belonged to a social stratum she'd never imagined entering. Her face when she saw him walking toward her contained everything, pride and anxiety, and fierce protective love that had sustained them both through 30 years of making do with less. He kissed her cheek, sat beside her, felt her hand grip his under the table. "You okay, baby? Ask me in 2 hours." She squeezed tighter. "That girl's running around like her hair's on fire. Saw her fixing a centerpiece that looked perfectly fine already." "She has no idea, does she?" "None." Lorraine shook her head slowly. "This is going to break her." "She broke herself. I'm just providing clarity." "That's what you tell yourself to sleep at night?" The question hit harder than she probably intended. Ezekiel didn't have a good answer, wasn't sure anymore whether this was justice or revenge dressed in justice's clothing. Wasn't sure it mattered. The mechanism was already in motion, gears turning toward revelation that couldn't be stopped, even if he wanted to stop it. Dinner was served in courses that kept coming, each more elaborate than the last, wine flowing from bottles that probably cost more than Ezekiel had made in a month at the warehouse. Conversations around him discussed market trends and political scandals, and vacation properties in locations he'd never visit. He participated minimally, offering non-committal sounds when people at his table tried to include him. His attention split between watching Cassandra work and counting minutes until everything changed. She was magnificent in her element, solving problems before they became visible, anticipating needs, making the impossible look effortless. This was the version of Cassandra that had attracted him initially, competent and alive, and fully present in moments that mattered to her. He wished those moments had included him more often. Wished she'd brought this intensity to their relationship instead of reserving it for professional advancement. Between courses, she passed near his table, eyes scanning arrangements, checking details. She glanced at him without recognition, looked right past him toward something that needed adjusting behind his chair. The moment felt surreal, sitting 5 feet from his fiancée while she treated him like furniture. Part of the security detail maybe, or a board member she hadn't been introduced to. Someone whose presence required acknowledgement but not actual attention. Then she was gone, moving to the next crisis, the next detail, performing the role she'd prepared for without knowing the script was about to flip. Grayson stood as dessert plates were being cleared, moved to the podium at the room's front, tapped the microphone twice. Conversations dimmed. 500 faces turned toward him, waiting. "Thank you all for joining us this evening to honor Solomon Blackwood." His voice carried authority built over decades of speaking to powerful people accustomed to being the one speaking. He outlined Solomon's history briefly, touched on major achievements, mentioned the foundation's charitable work, painted a picture of a complicated man who'd built something lasting. Solomon was intensely private about many aspects of his life. He valued discretion over publicity, substance over show. But there was one area where privacy crossed into secrecy, and that was his family. Ezekiel felt his pulse accelerate, blood rushing in his ears, loud enough he almost missed Grayson's next words. Solomon had a son, Ezekiel. He and Solomon were estranged for many years due to circumstances Solomon regretted until his final day. In his will, Solomon left explicit instructions that his entire estate, all holdings, assets, and responsibilities, should pass to Ezekiel. Movement at the ballroom's edge. Cassandra frozen in position near the service entrance. Clipboard lowered, face draining of color as she processed what was being announced at an event she'd coordinated without knowing its full significance. The estate is valued at $4.2 billion. Ezekiel has chosen to accept this inheritance and the responsibilities that come with it. Tonight, we formally introduce him not just as Solomon's son, but as the new chairman of Blackwood Global Enterprises. Grayson's eyes found Ezekiel across the room. "Please stand and be recognized. Ezekiel Blackwood." Time compressed into a single breath. Ezekiel stood, feeling 500 pairs of eyes lock onto him, hearing the ripple of surprise that moved through the room as people processed the disconnect between his face and their expectations. He registered recognition dawning on various faces. The black man in his 30s who'd been seated quietly at dinner, who nobody had particularly noticed, was the heir they'd come to acknowledge. Then his eyes found Cassandra. She stood near the wall, clipboard now fallen to the floor, one hand pressed against her mouth, face cycling through expressions too fast to catalog. Shock gave way to confusion, confusion to dawning horror, horror to something that looked like grief. Their eyes met across the distance, across the gulf of everything unsaid and all the truths she'd been too blind to see. Ezekiel watched her understand, saw the precise moment she remembered the prenup, realized what she'd done, comprehended the magnitude of her miscalculation. The room erupted in applause. People stood, a standing ovation for the new chairman, for Solomon's heir, for the story they'd already started writing about the warehouse worker who'd inherited billions. Ezekiel acknowledged it mechanically, nodding, raising one hand in recognition, playing the part he'd been assigned while watching Cassandra's world disintegrate in real time. She backed toward the service exit, hands still covering her mouth, eyes never leaving his face, moving like someone underwater, fighting against resistance only she could feel. Then she was gone, disappeared into the warren of service hallways, fled from the scene of her unintended self-destruction. Grayson continued speaking, outlining succession plans, introducing board members, managing the machinery of transition. Ezekiel barely heard him, still seeing Cassandra's face, the expression that would probably haunt both of them for different reasons. The moment everything she'd built collapsed under weight of truth she'd been too arrogant to imagine. Lorraine's hand found his again, grounding him, her voice barely audible under the applause. No going back now, baby. No going back. Only forward into whatever came next. Into the life Solomon had built and abandoned him to inherit. Into the understanding that money solves some problems while creating others. Into the knowledge that Cassandra had measured him wrong and would spend however long it took to process the price of her miscalculation. The applause finally faded. People returned to their seats. Grayson finished his remarks. The evening continued around Ezekiel while he sat in the center of transformation. No longer the person he'd been when he entered this room, but not yet comfortable in the skin of who he was becoming. Someone would find Cassandra eventually. Someone would check on her, offer comfort, try to make sense of what had happened. But that someone wouldn't be Ezekiel. He'd said everything he needed to say by not saying anything at all, by letting truth speak with a voice louder than any words he could have chosen. The ballroom doors opened to a terrace overlooking grounds lit by strategically placed lights that turned landscaping into art. Guests filtered outside, conversations resuming at volumes that suggested processing shock through social performance. Ezekiel followed, needing air, needing space, needing a moment to breathe before the next wave of obligations crashed over him. He stood at the terrace railing, looking out at his father's estate, at the physical manifestation of wealth built over 40 years by a man who died alone in a Tribeca apartment, who'd accumulated billions but couldn't figure out how to maintain connection with the people who should have mattered most. And Ezekiel understood, maybe for the first time, that Solomon's greatest gift wasn't the money. It was the warning encoded in his absence. The lesson about what happened when you let achievement replace relationship, when you measured success by accumulation instead of connection, when you built empires but forgot to maintain the foundations that made empire building meaningful. Cassandra had learned that lesson tonight in the hardest way possible. So had Ezekiel. Different lessons from the same moment, both of them changed by truth delivered at exactly the right time to teach exactly the wrong people exactly what they needed to learn.